So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second DRYvER webinar, the effects of drying on stream biodiversity. So it's the second webinar of a 5 webinars series in the frame of DRYvER project, which was funded by the European program Horizon 2020. So the first webinar is available on DRYvER website and social media, if you want to have a look at it also. So for those who are not in DRYvER project, in 2 words, DRYvER investigates how biodiversity, ecosystem functions, ecosystem services, and their values in dry river networks are directly and indirectly altered by climate change. So for this, the work is divided in several work packages. And today, Annika and Loic will present us some results from the second work package. So thank you again for coming. And now I will let Annika present you her slides. So I will share the screen, sorry. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, looks good. Thanks, Margot. Yeah, welcome on my behalf as well. Me and Loic will talk about the biodiversity results, preliminary results. You can change the slide. First, I'm going to tell a little about the background and sampling design, and then I'll briefly tell about the main results of drying impacts on alpha diversity and community structures, and then Loic will tell us about macroinvertebrate trait. Next one, please. Well, this is just a general background. River networks are really threatened due to human impacts, including climate change, and over half of the global river network has already drying channels, and the amount is increasing fast. And DRYvER is a Horizon project that aims to tackle some of the problems related to drying. I won't go into detail with this project description. Margot told some points about it. Next one, please. This is the study design. We had 6 drying river networks in Europe that are the focal DRNs, drying river networks. In Finland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Croatia, France, and Spain. And we had at least 20 study sites in each catchment. And 2 years ago, in 2021, we did altogether 6 sampling campaigns in each of the study catchments. And we sampled eDNA from biofilms and sediments, also macroinvertebrates. We also measured environmental variables. And then for fish, there were 2 sampling campaigns. Next, please. These are the photos from maybe it was April 2021 in the Finnish DRN. These are some photos of biological sampling. We really got ourselves wet there at that point. Next, please. So we also had different environmental variables. I'm briefly gonna introduce them. During each sampling time at every site, we measured geomorphological variables such as the bankful wetted width and stream bed particle size. We also measured hydrological variables, discharge and water depth and so on. We also had physicochemical variables that could be measured in situ, like temperature and pH and conductivity. We also determined biological variables, like coverage of different groups of plants and woody material. And for each site, we also once determined, of course, the coordinates and altitude and basin area and so on, and also riparian vegetation. Next, please. Then we got drying metrics from work package 1. That theme was covered in the previous DRYvER webinar. So they produced lots of different drying metrics, and we used those as explanatory variables in our analysis. The photos there are from a camera trap from some Finnish site. So there were clear changes in the water situation throughout the sampling campaigns. Next, please. So this is just one example of how to use the drying metrics. My colleague Henna made this plot. This plot shows that in general, the campaign number 4 was the driest. This variable here is like the proportion of network length with flow intermittence. So it's like a catchment scale drying metric. But the 4th campaign was usually the driest one. Next, please. This is an example map showing how the drying metrics could be visualized. This was number of dry days in 2021, and well, this is from the Finnish DRN, so those pink dots there are our sites. Next one, please. Okay, now I'm gonna go into the results. These are from the report that we finalized in July, August this year, and there were lots of people involved in this. And these are preliminary results I'm going to show, and there will be some follow-up analysis. I know some people are doing them right now, and the rest of us will do those next year. Okay. Oh, and you can download the document at the DRYvER.eu site. It's really easy to find if you're interested. Next, please. These plots just show how taxon richness varied between the campaigns. in perennial and temporary streams, and these examples are from Spain and Finland. But there were some interesting patterns. For example, the fungi seemed to jump to another level in terms of taxon richness after during the fourth campaign, which was the driest one. And that was, I think it was pretty common in all the DRNs, not just for Spain and Finland. And also from these plots, I'd like to point out the macroinvertebrates. There was a clear difference in the level of taxon richness between perennial and temporary streams. That was uniform for all DRNs. So the perennial always had higher richness of macroinvertebrates. Yes. Next one, please. Okay. How was drying actually related to alpha diversity? Well, these analyses showed that for diatoms and macroinvertebrates, the taxon richness generally declined due to drying. It wasn't significant in all the DRNs always, but the general pattern was a decline. And interestingly, for fungi, taxon richness actually increased with drying. And we were thinking that maybe some terrestrial taxa quickly colonized the dried up stream beds. We didn't go into the deeper analysis with that one, but that sounds plausible. And for bacteria and fish, we didn't find any patterns between alpha diversity and drying. And I have to say that for fish, the amount of observations as well as the number of species was usually very, very low, or there were no even. Yeah, in the plots you see the S refers to species richness for macroinvertebrates and for MOTU richness for the microbes. We did some models, other models with these data, and the linear mixed effect models showed that also showed that the negative relationships on the left side were real also by those analyses, and on the right side they were positive. Next one, please. Okay, my colleague Henna Snorre did these variation partitioning analysis for all the different biological groups and used all the environmental variables and spatial variables and intermittence drying metrics. And well, I'm not gonna show everything because these are a nightmare to, I don't know, interpret. But just to give you an idea how these results look like, these are for bacteria, biofilm and sediment. And you can see the amount of explained variation by each variable group. So yeah, environment is very important. Well, very important. It's relative because the amount of variation actually explained, well, it's usually well below 25%. So for bacteria, it's pretty normal that the R2s are rather low. But yeah, this is how they look like. Next slide, please. This is non-flying and flying macroinvertebrates. This is a little bit easier to interpret. The R2's explanatory powers are higher than for the bacteria in the previous slide. So someone has their microphone on.
De aquí, sí, digan. Sí.
Okay,
you can go ahead, Annika.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the environment seems to be pretty important for both groups of macroinvertebrates. There's also, well, if you look at the force campaigns, there seems to be more of the intermittence and environment and intermittence effects. For example, the red bars are more common during or after the force campaign. But the reason why I wanted to show this is like that the R2s for flying macroinvertebrates were generally higher than for the non-flying ones, meaning that flying macroinvertebrates are probably more deterministic. So there's more stochasticity in the community structuring of non-flying macroinvertebrates. Loic will tell more about macroinvertebrates in a while. Next one, please. So Henna also made these plots. These show the explanatory powers of pure environmental variables and pure spatial variables. And these aim to describe how drying relates to these explanatory variable groups. And well, drying was associated with decreased effects of pure environment and pure space for algae and for sediment fungi. And it seems that with increased drying, at least these microbial communities could come more stochastic, at least when considering the R2 values of the variation partitioning. Okay, I think that was my last one at this point. Loic, you can continue.
Hi, everyone. Just going to make a technical check. You hear me, right?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. I've been experiencing some technical issues, so I hope everything was going to be fine. So on my side, I've been analyzing macroinvertebrate communities, and I wanted to study them into the perspective of drying river network as a dynamic meta-community systems. So when you look at a river network that is experiencing periodic drying events, you can see that depending on where you are as a community in the river network, you have different level of connectivity with other communities. In that picture, drying events will tend to perturbate local communities by just increasing mortality for the local macroinvertebrate. This has multiple consequences. So first, of course, the community will dry and a lot of macroinvertebrates will die, but also you may have some part of the river network that becomes isolated from the rest of the network. And also, depending on how isolated a drying patch has been, it may take a long time to recover after a drying event, depending on how well connected it is to the rest of the river network. And this is the situation that we wanted to study with in regards to macroinvertebrate communities. Next slide, please. So to deal with that, we know that macroinvertebrates have different ecological strategies that depends on their traits. So usually we distinguish two main strategies. So first, resistance strategy, with some macroinvertebrate having a low mortality rate and exhibiting some resistance traits. So I put the example of Aquarius, a species that is able to be dormant during drying events. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have some macroinvertebrates that have resilience strategy. Here, the idea is not to withstand a drying event, but to just be able to not be there when it happens and to come back afterwards. So these species usually have a high dispersal rate. They tend to have a high fecundity as well. So being able to recolonize faster a previously dried community, or they tend to have many reproductive cycles. Next slide, please. So we wanted to work on 3 different hypotheses regarding this system. So first, we wanted to study intermittency as a periodic perturbation that affect communities. And we have the hypothesis that because it's a perturbation, intermittent community will have a lower richness and they will tend to be more functionally convergent, meaning that to stay and maintain your abundance into a dry community, you need to have specific functional traits. And also we expect that resistant taxa will be more abundant in intermittent communities. Second, we wanted to look at how connectivity of river communities as something that will counteract a bit intermittency. So we expect that communities that are well connected to the rest of the network will have increased richness and increased functional diversity, and also that they will have an increased abundance of resilient taxa, so fecund and mobile species. Finally, because we have been, as Annika said, we have been studying multiple drying river networks across Europe, we expect biogeographical differences, and in particular, we expect that there will be more resistant taxa in the Mediterranean systems of Croatia and Spain. Next slide, please. So to do that, we have been studying the functional trait database that has been compiled by Romain Sarameyan, and combining his database with the classic database from Taché. And I've been focusing on life history traits, such as fecundity, the number of reproductive cycles per year of macroinvertebrate species, the lifespan, and also some dispersal traits. So whatever they are prone to drifting, so means just letting themselves like go with the flow, or various dispersal modes, aquatic, aerial, passive, or active. And finally, another trait that's linked to resistance form. So whatever a species is able to have desiccation resistant forms such as egg, cocoons, or just dormancy behavior. Next slide, please. And so we've been studying like various diversity metrics, so richness and functional diversity. Because I didn't really want to study each trait individually, we have been using a multivariate analysis called a co-inertia analysis to look at the main synthetic trait axis of that are structuring communities. And we'll relate all that to intermittency status. So whatever a segment was intermittent or perennial, and its spatial temporal connectivity. We also look at environment and time of the year, but I won't go into details with this. Next slide, please. to compute reverse spatial temporal connectivity, so that's not really something that is like necessarily like easy or straightforward, but I've been using the metric that has been developed by David Cunillera-Moncusi. And so he's created a metric called STCon that is calculating how in a certain window of time before sampling, the community has been well connected to the rest of the river network. So this is something that you get one value per community, and the higher it means that you have been well connected in, like, for instance, the last 30 days to the rest of the river network, or very low means that you have been very isolated from the rest of the network. And if we look a bit at how it looks on the right across DRN and across segment types, river segment types, sorry, we see that there's quite some difference across drying river network with, for instance, the Finnish river segment tend to be very well connected to each other across river segment type or even time of the year, whereas in the other DRN, it's much more variable. And there was no strong difference in connectivity between perennial and intermittent, which means also that we can distinguish the respective effect of connectivity and intermittency in the community data. Next slide, please. So if we look as a first step to the diversity of intermittent versus perennial river segments, and we're going to ignore the biogeographical component here, we can see here on the graph, so on the left, you have richness as a function of spatial temporal connectivity, and on the right, you have functional diversity. And you can see first that the blue line, which is related to perennial segments, is usually higher than the orange line, which is related to intermittent. So this means that intermittent river segments are less rich and more functionally convergent, which is coherent with the hypothesis that there is a strong abiotic filtering in intermittent communities that is selecting for a few specific species with specific traits. However, with connectivity, we see that there is an increase, very light for richness and more strong for functional diversity. So you see that the orange line is increasing, and that's why it's full and not dash. And this actually means that if a intermittent river segment has been well connected to the rest of the river network, then it becomes richer in species and also more functionally diverse. Connectivity, although it varied a lot for perennial segments, had no effect on its diversity or richness. So now we kind of want to know, like, what's behind this. Like, okay, we see that there is diversity stuff going on, but what's going on, like, in terms of what kind of species are where? So next slide, please. So coordination is a bit strange to interpret, but if you look first, so this is a method that is going to put into a 2D graph the different communities. That's the point that you are seeing on the right square everywhere, and they are separated according to what kind of species in terms of traits are making their composition. So if a community here is more on the left side of the graph, it means that it tends to have species that are more fecund, that are also that tends to have a short lifespan, and also that tend to be mobile. So this is the arrows that you see going towards the left side of the graph. On the other hand, if the community is on the right side, it means that it's more fixed, tends that it doesn't move a lot, and also it's more, it lives longer. And usually this main left to right gradient separated species that have a more lotic strategy, so typical from flowing rivers, to species with a lentic strategy that tends to be more into, like, slow moving waterways. And also it relates to the classical aquatic ecology groups of EPT on the left and HOC on the right. There was also a strong gradient that is separating communities based on whether they contain a lot of species that have multiple reproductive cycles per year or not. So that will be communities on the top of the graph and versus communities on the bottom of the graph. Overall, if we look at functional structure across DRN, we'll see that the ellipses are kind of all smashed in the middle and not really like separating themselves. So this means that there was quite a similar composition in terms of traits across DRN. But there was the Finnish and the Hungarian one has slightly different profile because they were a bit more separated on the vertical axis, which means that in Finland you have more species that have a large number of reproductive cycles, whereas in Hungary you have more species that have less single reproductive cycles per year, and that tends to be more dormant. We can see also here that the arrow related to resistance traits that are in purple are kind of going a bit everywhere, which means that you have different resistance strategies that are a bit spread out in all the functional trait space. Next slide, please. So then I kind of wanted to look like what was the impact of intermittency. So this is basically the same graph as before, but the arrow are designing the average position of a river segment in DRN according to the intermittent status. So if we look at the color scheme, you see that they are kind of the same area as the ellipse before. And we see an arrow is linking from its beginning a perennial segment, and the tip is going to the intermittent communities of that DRN. So it's a bit complicated like this, but like the bottom line here is you see that the arrow are going into different directions. This means that the impact of intermittency is not the same across DRN. In particular, you can see that the Croatian and the Spain arrows are going towards the left, whereas all the continental DRN are going towards the right. This means that in non-Mediterranean DRN, intermittent segments tends to have more species that are long-lived, that are less mobile, and that are also less fecund, whereas this doesn't happen in the Mediterranean DRN. However, across every DRN, we notice that all species tend to have more reproductive cycles when they are in intermittent river segments. Next slide, please. And then we wanted to look at what's the impact of increased connectivity for the river segment. So here, same graph. The tip of the arrow represent like well-connected rivers, and the beginning of the arrow represent communities that are not well connected. If the arrow is full, it means it's a perennial segment, and intermittent, it's a dash segment. So we see here something very simple. All arrows are going the same direction. So this means that in that case, when a river segment is well connected to the rest of the river network, then there is an increased abundance of species that are mobile of every kind. So flying, swimming, whatever. But like it's going all into the same direction. It's homogeneous across DRN and across type of river segments. Next slide, please. So what does all these community patterns say to us? It's that there is intermittency selects specific traits that are related to drying. That's why communities have a lower richness, they have a lower functional diversity. We see that intermittency tends to select lentic strategies in continental DRN, so species that are a long lifespan, that are less fecund, that are more fixed. Whereas in Mediterranean DRN, you have intermittency select more resilient strategy that are based on strong dispersal and high fecundity. We see also that well-connected intermittent segments tend to have a structure that is closer to perennial segments. They are richer, they are more functionally diverse, and they tend to be more associated also with a resilient-based strategy, high fecundity, high mobility. And what I think happens here is that when you have a river segment that is well connected, you have a coexistence of both resistance and resilience strategy because they are connected to the rest of the river network. There was also a complex pattern of resistance strategy. Like we didn't really find like a specific resistance syndrome that were distinct from, that we could distinguish from other kind of ecological strategy. Some species have resistance trait a bit everywhere, and it's not really seems to be a trade-off with other functional traits. which may call for need for better, more specific traits. In particular, we didn't have a strong pattern indicating that there was more resistance strategies into Mediterranean DRNs. Next slide, please. So why we do all that is that I want to go from this, like we saw that macroinvertebrates have specific traits that help them to cope with drying and connectivity variation in the river network. So I'm currently working on integrating those insights into a theoretical model that's called Cantal, and this is a simulation model that's able to simulate species with different life history traits, so that are a bit similar to what we talk about, so fecundity, mortality, migration, and resistance, and different mode of dispersal. And also that is able to simulate like the impact of perturbation on communities. Next slide, please. Yes, and so here you have an example of a simulation that we can run with this model. So here we have a simple case of two species. When we compare what happened into a meta community with a species that doesn't move a lot and that have a low mortality compared to a species with a high mortality but high fecundity and that is able to disperse a lot. On the left side, you have a situation in the meta community where there is no drying events, and you see that the fixed low mortality species tends to have a very high abundance in the meta community compared to the other one. And when you have periodic driving events, a bit like we see in nature, we saw that it affects disproportionately the fixed low mortality species, but it gives a window of coexistence for the mobile species that is able to use the dried community after flow resumption to increase its abundance for a short amount of time. So that might be the kind of situation that happened in Mediterranean DRN, for instance. I won't go into much detail, but you can ask me a question if you want. Next slide, please. And in the end, I hope to integrate this kind of simulation model and all the insights that we have seen from the diversity pattern analysis into a calibration schemes to be able to calibrate these models based on empirical trait data. And yeah, so this will be a statistical framework that will combine empirical trait data, the hydrological data that has been produced in WP1, and I will combine all this to calibrate the process-based model so that we are able in the end to make a better prediction about the impact of hydrological variation on the community structure. So this is a calibration scheme that I've been developing in previous work. If you want to look at it, it's not on Reverse, but it's interesting nonetheless. Next slide, please. Well, Annika, I'm going to leave you with the conclusion.
Sure. Okay, so final take-home messages. Drying was indeed associated with decreases in taxon richness for diatoms and macroinvertebrates, but fungi seemed to like drying in terms of taxon richness. Overall, the relationships between drying and community structures and community assembly were pretty complex. Flying macroinvertebrates were more deterministic than non-flying ones, so that's interesting. And for microbes, especially algae and sediment fungi, increased drying might be associated with more stochastic community assembly. When drying events become more common and or longer, it's likely that they become more important for stream community structuring and biodiversity in the future. Next one.
Yeah, so on my side, the conclusion I have from my work is that the functional traits of macroinvertebrates are really related to intermittency and connectivity variation in the river network. I think one of the most striking results is that there is a biogeographical differences of the winning strategy in intermittent river segments in Mediterranean versus non-Mediterranean DRN. So on one side, Mediterranean, you have more like resilient strategy, and in the non-Mediterranean, like species that are more like, let's say, lentic strategies. So this actually calls for a question, so what will happen in the future with increased intermittency? Like if drying river network in continental Europe like move towards a more Mediterranean regime, we can wonder what's going to happen to all this lentic strategy that may not be adapted anymore to increased intermittency, river intermittency. And this I think calls for like a bit what I talked about at the end. So I hope that we are able we have perspective towards the prediction of macroinvertebrate dynamics using functional traits that we are gathering into this trait database. And I think it's going to be very useful to predict the future trajectories of river communities with climate change. I think that's it. Yeah, well, thanks to every one of you for your attention.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Loïc and Annika, for these presentations. So now, if anyone has a question, please feel free. You can put your camera, your microphone. Yes, Loïc, you want to say something? Okay, so me, I have a question. Can we use a trait-based approach for microbial communities?
Can I reply that? Okay. Yeah, we tried to do that in the deliverable report, but yes, it's possible. But in our case, we used eDNA data, and so we got the MOTUs and not true species identities for the microbes. And well, I know something about diatoms, so for diatoms, we could link the MOTUs reliably to like less than 10% of the total number of MOTUs or species in the dataset. So it didn't make much sense to do the trait-based analysis, at least for diatoms there. But there are plans to go deeper into microbial traits next year. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else has a question? So I have another question. How can we study better macroinvertebrate resistant traits? Loïc, Annika, are you here?
Yes, I think Loïc is the better one to reply to that question.
Okay. Well, maybe he has a connection problem. Okay. Well, if anyone, if no one has another question, I think we can stop the webinar. So once again, thank you, Annika and Loic, but also thank you everyone for joining the webinar. So next one will be in 1 month. You will receive all the information for those who are in DRYvER by email and for the other ones on the social media. And also this webinar will be on the the recording of this webinar will be added on the website. So if you know people who would have liked to join but was not available, please let them know. And yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.